Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building More Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive Workspaces for Tech Professionals. Thanks for joining us today. We are glad that you're here. I'm Courtney Patterson, Senior Content Strategist at DICE, and joining me today are two fantastic panelists. We have Nancy Harris, who is the founder and CEO of Restart Consulting. We also have Kevin Welch, who's VP IT Recruiting Manager for Zions Bancorporation, both of whom I will let say hello and introduce themselves to you in just a moment. But first, there are just a few housekeeping items we want to go through before we dive into the content today. So first of all, we will be recording this webinar, and we'll be providing that recording to you within the next 24 hours via email. So watch for that if you want to share it with colleagues, or if for some reason you have to drop in the next 45 minutes, feel free to watch the rest of it on demand. You can also find recordings of all of our webinars on our DICE YouTube channel at any time, including this webinar recording, which will be added later this week. We will be referencing DICE's annual Equality in Tech report in just a little bit. And if you haven't already checked it out, we will include a link to the report in the follow-up email so that you can dive into the data a little more deeply and understand the state of diversity in tech and how it impacts your organizations. Today, we'll also be answering a few questions that were submitted through when you registered. But if you do have questions throughout the webinar for the panelists, please use the question box in the webinar control panel to submit questions, excuse me, and we will get to them as we have time at the end of the webinar today. And then finally, after the webinar today, excuse me, we will be sending out an email with a short feedback survey. And just so you know, we read every response and we use those responses to help us improve DICE webinars, make sure that we're covering content that is important to you, valuable to you. So please take just a couple of minutes to fill out that survey for us and let us know what you'd like to learn from future webinars and how we can improve them. All right. And back to the reason you are all here, to learn how to build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces for tech professionals. I want to take a couple of minutes to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and say hello, and then we will chat about the state of diversity in tech and move into kind of our more panel discussion. So Nancy, I will start with you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where people are calling from. My name is Nancy Harris, and I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. And as Courtney mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Restart Consulting, and we work with organizations to create equitable and inclusive workplaces. And I've been in the people talent space for 20 years and have had the opportunity to work in the tech space with Accenture and a number of other small tech consultancies as well too, as clients and also as an employee. So I'm excited to be with everybody today.
Thanks, Nancy. And Kevin?
First off, thank you everyone for joining. I am Kevin Welch. I'm the VP of IT Recruiting at Zions Bancorporation. We are a West Coast bank. Zions Bancorporation is the holding company for 8 affiliates throughout the West Coast. I've been with Zions Bancorporation as an overall recruiter since 2013. I live in Park City, Utah, and prior to that, I worked for a company out of Chicago called Prestige Staffing and worked with many large organizations since about 2008 throughout the Chicagoland area. So recruiting is my passion. I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Thank you both for being here. And as you can tell, we are very lucky to have each of these panelists with us today with all the knowledge and the experience that they bring to the table. both from the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, but also the tech recruiting space. To kick off our discussion today, I want to share a few stats about the state of diversity in tech for the tech profession specifically, and kind of set the stage for an understanding of where we're going with the discussion. But before we do that, we do have a poll that we'd like to share with the audience to just kind of gauge where most of our audience feels they are in their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey within their organization. So I am going to launch a poll here. And you should be seeing it on your screen shortly. The question is going to be, do you believe there is a lack of diversity in your tech force? So this is specific to tech professionals within your organization, and then your answer choices are yes, no, or unsure. So as we give folks just a minute to answer that poll question, I do want to clarify today that we are talking about tech professionals across all industries and verticals, not just those companies that we think of as traditional tech companies, because the reality is almost every business today is a tech company, in that they are leveraging the power of technology to innovate, compete, or simply just take care of day-to-day business needs. And then also I want to note that, of course, diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces are important for all employees, not just tech professionals. We'll be spending a lot of time today talking specifically about tech professionals, but obviously a lot of what we share today will be applicable across a broader, more organizational level too. And that's why this information is so important. We are talking about a community of professionals who work for organizations across all locations, business sizes, types, industries. So it's very important that we have this conversation as recruiters and HR professionals of all professionals. So looks like we have a good amount of answers coming in. So I'm going to close this poll and share the answers with everyone. So it looks like 69% of our attendees are saying, yes, there is a lack of diversity in their tech workforce, which really aligns with this first stat we're going to share with you today, that 68% of business leaders report a lack of diversity in their tech workforce. So across tech professions in all industries, women, people of color, and those who belong to the LGBTQIA+ community, they all continue to lack representation. And these stats confirm that. So also women hold just 25% of computer science related jobs. And then this one is very interesting at the bottom here. 62% of US jobs in the tech sector are held by white technologists, while Black technologists hold just 7% of jobs. Hispanic technologists hold 8% of jobs, and Asian technologists hold 20% of jobs. So you can see that this is a very important topic because we do need more diversity in tech, because we know that like-minded people are going to come up with very similar ideas. They usually stick to the status quo when it comes to business innovation. So kind of at the source there is less diversity means less creativity. But there are so many more reasons that representation is important, especially in tech. So I would love to open the floor up to our panelists. Maybe we'll start with you, Nancy, first, and then go to Kevin to share any additional reasons that why representation is so important and why it's especially important in the tech field.
Yeah, well, Courtney, you touched on something that was really important, and that is this: if you don't have the diversity, you lack the creativity. And so when we don't have the different perspectives, when we don't have different lived experiences to draw from, it really does impact the type of solutions that we put forth. I also want to share something a little bit different that we often don't talk about, is that when we have diverse teams, people with different backgrounds, it's sometimes a challenge as a leader to manage teams, and sometimes we kind of downplay that. But one of the things that I think that's positive outcome of that is that it really helps us to up level our skills as a leader when we have diverse teams, when we have people with different backgrounds. It really does challenge us as leaders, managers, project managers, whatever your role is, to really upskill yourself and become a better leader. The other thing I want to add to that I think it's so important when we have diversity across our teams is that it really does help us to connect with our clients and our customers as well too. And I think that that's something that we often forget as well too. So those are just a couple of things that I've thought of that really, when we've got diverse teams, it's such a makes us so much more impactful and important. So I can toss it over to Kevin and see what he thinks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to reiterate a little bit of what you both said. I was listening to the author Simon Sinek recently, and he talks about how a lot of diversity is really about perspective. If you have this homogeneous group, everybody comes from a similar background, we all have similar blinders on, we all have similar unconscious bias. So then you don't have what you can both touch on, that creative thought. So we need to have groups that have different perspective, that have different backgrounds, not better or worse, different backgrounds, to come at challenges from a different angle so that we have better solutions for our hurdles that we have daily or the major technology hurdles we have in our organization. And that different perspective can be, you know, raised in a different religion, coming from a different company, coming from a different industry, coming from a different country and where you were raised. So different thought and perspective is extremely important, I think, in advancing your organization in the right direction.
Yeah, that's really great. And I love how each of you focused on how it can expand your business, it can expand the capacity and the success that your business sees. Um, and you both kind of touched on this too. It improves the employee experience, and that's really important. So in our Equality in Tech report this year, we reported that perception of racial discrimination was actually up from 55% in 2020 to 57% in 2021 for Black technologists. And technologists who identify as women actually reported gender discrimination at double the rate of those who identify as men. And you can kind of see that visualized here in the graph. But discrimination can occur in many different ways. Some of the ways that our survey respondents said that discrimination occurs most frequently is salary and benefits, leadership and promotion opportunities, and also respect for one's technical abilities. So all of these factors obviously play into how valued employees feel, how engaged they are with their work, how engaged they are with their bosses and their teams. And these are also factors that HR professionals and recruiters can actually influence. So Nancy, from your perspective, consulting for so many different types of businesses and sizes of corporations and companies, what are some of the impactful ways that you've seen HR professionals and recruiters work to dismantle this discrimination within their own organizations?
Yeah, it's first of all, those stats, it's like it's jarring, and it's, yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's very jarring to see those statistics. But one of the things that I've seen HR professionals and talent acquisition professionals do to dismantle this is, it's so important to start with yourself. Really look at and know and understand your own biases and begin to do some of your own self-work, because when you start there, you can really help to talk about influence your hiring managers and other leaders within the organization. So I would encourage anyone, I think sometimes I spent 20 years in HR, so I think sometimes by default people think, oh, you're HR, you actually understand everything about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's not always the case. So organizations and professional HR professionals and talent acquisition professionals who are really helping to dismantle, they're starting with themselves, whether they're doing assessments like IDI, which is called intercultural development inventory, just doing an assessment again, just to get a baseline in terms of where they are. I think the other thing that they're doing is that they're being really intentional. They're asking questions of their hiring manager, and I know we'll get into some of that a little bit later on, but really in order to dismantle some of these things that are showing up in terms of these statistics, you've got to be really intentional and you've got to be courageous. You've got to have the courage to be able to push back and challenge in a way that's going to help people to see things a little bit differently. So if I think about it, where I'm working with organizations and I see what they're doing, those are some of the things that I see them doing to dismantle.
That's great. Yeah, and then Kevin, working specifically in the tech recruiting space, what is your perspective on ways that tech recruiters specifically have influence over these areas of perceived discrimination, like I mentioned earlier, salary and benefits, leadership and promotion opportunities, and respect for one's technical abilities?
Yeah, I think number one on my list, and not easy, but very well known for recruiters, is salary. As Nancy said, be very intentional. As a recruiter, you understand the industry. You've seen these numbers probably. You should have access to corporate data and information and salary levels and titles. Utilize that information and get on your soapbox when working with your hiring manager to make sure you are making an offer for retention and an equitable and fair offer. I really think it's on our shoulders as recruiters to make the appropriate offer for many different reasons. Um, do not look at their past salary. The manager, in my opinion, doesn't even necessarily need to know their past salary. What you're offering is based upon your budget, the skills that you're requiring for the role in relation to that person. I think also as we move backwards a little bit in terms of process, we all have bias. We all have unconscious bias, no matter what. I don't know if as human beings we'll get to a place where we don't, but you can help reduce that unconscious bias by having a diverse interview panel. In the first interview, the second interview, and the third interview, if you have those three phases. In connection with that, you should have a structured interview process. So every single candidate is being asked the same question, and then you are rating that candidate based upon their skill answers, so that when you as a group get together, move forward with one candidate versus others, you're basing it upon the same questions and how they answered those questions.
That's great. I really love the intentionality and also making sure that your interview panel is diverse in and of itself. Really good takeaways. So it's encouraging to hear that there is work being done, and that specific work that hopefully helps those on this webinar today and watching on demand, to help them impact their organizations and create change. So in our Equality in Tech report that I mentioned earlier, our survey data shows that less than half of tech professionals that were surveyed have actually been impressed with action to date at their current companies, when it comes to DE&I. So that really signals to us how much work is still left to be done and why this conversation is so important today. So moving from a place of understanding where we are currently in the landscape and kind of this need for diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces, I'd like to shift the discussion to how we get there. Since the summer of 2020, many organizations have renewed their focus on diversifying their workforce. But as we all know, it's not as simple as shifting some levers. So there are many layers to building diverse teams in workplaces. There have to be educational opportunities in place, for instance, for individuals to learn that computer science, software engineering, and web development are options for them, usually at a much younger age too, before they're even thinking about what company they would like to work for. So the industry and the work environment also has to be one that cultivates inclusion and provides psychological safety as well. So there's a lot of different factors that go into diversifying your workforce. It's not just the act of doing that. So Nancy, I would love to hear from you. How do you approach helping organizations not only kind of widen their net when it comes to sourcing technologists or professionals in general, but how do you help them think about building a diverse workplace in a more broader sense, just outside of recruiting, for instance?
Yeah, it's so important. It's like when I work with organizations, I always start with this question of why. What's your why? Why is it important for you, your organization, to have a diverse talent pool, diverse employees, not like Google or you insert company, but why is it important to you? And oftentimes people struggle with that. And so I would tell anybody when you're thinking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, start with that question of what's your why, know and understand that, and really be able to articulate it, because there will be some, we'll talk about this probably later, there'll be some tension, there'll be some pushback. So I think the clearer, the more intentional you are about your why is really important. The other thing is from a more practical standpoint to think about it, it's also important in terms of how you build relationships with other organizations. Courtney, I think we had a question that came in and someone mentioned that they were having a hard time getting diverse candidates and they were going to the same professional organization that wasn't really diverse. So then my question would be, if you're going to that same organization, maybe you need to build some relationships with some different organizations that are reflective of the type of candidates that you want to bring into your workplace. So I think it's first and foremost really knowing and understanding your why, being able to articulate that, and then from a practical standpoint, how do you go about building relationships? I kind of joke around and I'll say, oh, you'll go to the same school over and over and over again, right? We go to the same 5 schools and we wonder why we don't have any diversity there. It's like, okay, well, maybe we should go to some different schools. Maybe you don't get rid of them all at once, but to start slowly and steadily building those relationships, and being, again, I'm going to use the word probably over and over again, being intentional, knowing why, knowing when you talk about diverse candidates, what are you talking about? Have you looked at your data? Where are you underrepresented? Is it in women? Is it in people of color? And so once you start to know that information, be intentional, have that data, then that can help inform decisions in terms of who you partner with and the organizations and universities and institutions in which you want to I call it build relationships with over time.
That's really great. And we'll also touch on that. I love how you dig into what does building a diverse workplace mean for your organization. One of the questions that had come in was, we get this kind of, recruit more diverse talent, but that's like this blanket command coming from above, but there's no goal behind it. There's no roadmap. So we'll touch on that too. If you had that question, make sure you stay tuned, because I think that's really important to dig into the details, understand what exactly you're trying to do before you just go out there and try to do something. Kevin, from your perspective with recruiting tech professionals specifically, what are some of the ways that you make sure that your sourcing and recruiting practices are inclusive to all groups, including those that aren't well represented in tech professions today?
I'm going to piggyback onto one thing Nancy said, dig into the data. You got to find out where you're falling short as an organization and start there. And then once you have that data, there are so many organizations nowadays you can reach out to and you can partner with. And then you can go back to the data 6 months, a year later. Don't just randomly stick with a partner. Make sure that partner is providing you where you're lacking. But there are companies like direct employers where you can post all over. There are programmatic vendors like One Red Cent. There are great organizations like Women in Cybersecurity that are just phenomenal that you can partner with and go to conventions and post and then create those connections and those referrals. You know, as recruiters, referrals are our bread and butter. So once you have those connections with those groups and the individuals in the group, you're just going to kind of blossom from there in terms of the candidates and the diversity of candidates that you get. But you have to know where you're falling short first in order to know where to go.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kevin. And of course, we know it does not end at building a diverse team. You have to exemplify equitable practices within your organization. You have to have inclusive cultures in place in order to retain those employees that you've hired. So moving into this theme of advocating for equality and thinking about some of the stats that I shared earlier and some survey data that shows that discrimination is commonly felt by technologists through limited internal mobility, leadership and promotion opportunities, and also a lack of recognition and development. Nancy, I would love to hear from you. How can recruiters and HR leaders, how can they advocate for equity in their organizations? I know we've touched on it a little bit here and there so far, but specifically we received this question that I was referencing about how to approach conversations specifically about unconscious bias with hiring managers, how to approach those conversations as a recruiter if you recognize that a hiring manager is kind of just going for familiar candidates that all kind of follow a same profile. How would you approach a conversation with a hiring manager?
And I like what Kevin says, there's always this piece around data, but there's also this piece around education as well too. And so I would say if you're not doing it in your organization, it's so important to have some kind of baseline of training for hiring managers. And as part of that training, you really need to focus on unconscious bias. And I can't stress this enough. It can't just be like a one-time training, like there's the one time and we're done. Make it a part, of an ongoing conversation, dialogue, learning for your hiring managers. And you'll learn in your process as well too. And as Kevin said, we all have biases. We all walk into scenarios with unconscious and implicit bias. So being able to open up that door with hiring managers and being able to talk and educate. So I think I mentioned earlier, starting with yourself. So if you have some knowledge, you can start to impart that with your hiring managers. Encourage them if they have training within your organization to be able to take advantage of that as well too. That's something that's really important. The other thing, and Kevin touched on this before, is that when you can have a panel, when you have more than one person sharing their input into the hiring process, that helps to, we never eliminate it, but certainly it helps to quell the implicit and unconscious bias that may show up if it's just me hiring for my team and I don't have any other voices to help support in that as well too, or to maybe even like gently call you out on it as well too. That can help as well too. So I think the education piece, your own self-awareness, and then having a panel and other people part of the process can help as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. And Kevin, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that specific question as well, but also how HR professionals and tech recruiters can advocate for equity within their organizations? Maybe any experiences you've had that you'd like to share?
Yeah, education is really, really key. And you can have those conversations with the managers. But I think a really key item is that you're having those conversations, if your organization is already doing it with your leaders. That message about diversity and equity inclusion really needs to come from the top down. So I think it's so important to have that partnership with your leaders and making sure you're having that conversation and there's a buy-in. I have a hard time seeing a company being successful in DE&I if there's not support and continuous conversation and education from the top down. It's going to be really hard to have a successful DE&I program and to move the needle forward. So you need to have that conversation with leaders, and then you do have to take it upon yourself when you're going throughout the interview process to call out if you see a panel being too homogeneous, if you see a manager making decisions that kind of turn your head a little bit like a dog. You have to stand up and be that voice as a recruiter.
That's great. And
Can
I
I?
think oh yeah,
I
please,
was going to
Nancy.
say, I wanted to add something when we were talking about the education piece, because you started off talking about equality. And so I think it's important too that we differentiate and know the difference between equality and equity, right? And that when we're talking about equality, it means that it's the same. And when we're talking about equitable, it means that we may have to provide different resources, for example, to help I'll use for the example, to help women, get to pay parity within an organization. And when I think people default to the equal or it's equality. And I just want to share a brief story of an organization. I worked in an organization and we wanted to have more women traders. And in order to do that, we set up a completely bespoke program for women to help them get up to speed. Now, that wasn't equal because, the men in the organization didn't have access to that, but it was something to help set them up. And so it was that lens of equity to help prepare them to be traders, because historically they hadn't been represented in trading. We can go on and on in terms of why there weren't more women in the trading realm. So I think it's really important to know and understand the differentiation between the two, and also to know that you may get pushback, because when I worked in the organization, the leader got pushback for doing that. And eventually he decided to have men in the program, and then it just shifted and changed the whole dynamics of it. So I think in addition to understanding that difference between equality versus equity, that knowing when you do some things that are equitable, you may get pushback, and you really have to be able to stand firm and have the courage to be able to articulate why you're doing that. And to Kevin's point, that's going to be coming from leadership in the organization.
Thank you so much for making that differentiation. I think that's so important. Just understanding the difference between those, and what a great story to explain that. I think I love it. And that kind of leads us into this kind of last section about inclusion, which is also incredibly important. And then I'd like to take a few minutes just to focus on how recruiters and HR professionals can support an inclusive workplace. So in addition to all of the things that we've talked about so far, once they see those advocacy efforts kind of taking root, leadership is listening, hiring managers are listening, you're seeing a company-wide change, how can you, or what are some common approaches, Nancy specifically, that you share with organizations who are trying to work towards more inclusive workplaces? So thinking of once they've started started the train, so to speak, how do they keep it going and keep their workplace inclusive?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think another question that may have popped up as well too was someone said, do you start the DEI first or do you do the inclusion first? And I think you really need to do those simultaneously, right? Because you can focus on bringing on, I'll use the word underrepresented, talent into your workplace. But if the culture isn't one of inclusion or belonging, then you'll see people leaving the organization, which is not what the intention is. So really, when I work with organizations, I think in order to get that inclusive culture, you touched on something, it's important to have this kind of foundation of trust. It's really important, and I can't stress this enough when Kevin mentioned the leadership, accountability and responsibility, because I look at inclusive cultures, it's top and bottom, right? It's from all sides of it that help to create that inclusive culture. But really, as leaders within an organization, it's like doing what you say what you do, having that integrity behind your words. And I also believe it's so important to ask. Oftentimes, we don't ask. We get so caught up in our whirlwind of work that we don't slow down to ask employees what it is that they're feeling. Do they feel included? I mean, just really these simple things that we can do is just to ask are so important in terms of creating cultures of inclusivity and belonging. So I would say ask, do what you say what you do so that there's integrity, and have some transparency. Some transparency in terms of what it is that you're doing, and some vulnerability. Nobody has this figured out. I don't think we'll ever figure it out, and that's not the point of it, right? It's a journey. It's a part of, who we are as leaders in organizations. So I would say certainly kind of focus on those key things as you talk about inclusivity in the workplace.
That's great. And I really love what you said, just checking in with employees, asking how they're feeling. And we'll dive into that after this next question. But Kevin, I do want to give you the opportunity to share anything that you've either seen within your work or you've seen kind of just in the industry about just creating an inclusive workplace just in general or specifically for tech professionals.
Yeah, so at Zions Bancorporation, we created many different business relationship groups. I know some organizations, they call them executive relationship groups, but it's basically groups for, as Nancy noted, calling it the underrepresented group. So an LGBTQIA plus group, a veteran group, women in IT group. We just had a conversation with our veteran BRG, and it's so phenomenal because it gives our veterans a platform. It gives them a place to have a voice. It creates a space for allies to partner and help those individuals or help that underrepresented group. And you just create this, I think, phenomenal connection amongst individuals and create just a more simple, inclusive culture. And the stories that come out of it are awesome. And we have 30 people in my recruiting group. And in our conversation with the veteran BRG yesterday, we actually figured out that 2 of our HR people were at the same base, just 10 years apart. And they had no idea, and they worked together for 2 years. So it's just simple things like that I think really move the needle. As Nancy said, I don't know if we'll ever get to what's in the Constitution, all men are created equal, but it's an idealist view we can definitely move towards, and creating those groups I think is a huge part of that.
That's great. And as we're kind of nearing the end here and before we get to Q&A, I did want to go back to, Nancy, your point about checking in with employees. So we know that regularly, maybe sending out surveys or having these groups, these conversations is really important. Are there, and I'll pose it to either one of you or both of you really, what other ways would you suggest that organizations can use to measure the impact of these approaches that they're taking, these efforts that they're making, beyond just surveys and having these conversations? Are there other ways that organizations, specifically HR professionals within those organizations, can measure the impact? Nancy, I'll start with you.
I would say probably one of the most powerful has been through surveys. I also think depending on if you have a budget to be able to do this, if you can, bring in some outside perspective and help, be that doing focus groups, one-on-one interviews and conversations to really kind of dig a little bit deeper when you do have survey and survey data. But I think it's also important to not just look at the numbers, look at the quantitative and the qualitative. I'll just quickly use a story of an organization I've been working with, and their focus is by 2024 to have a certain percentage of women in the workplace. And as they looked at the data, they realized, oh, we're bringing in a certain number of women, but a number of women are leaving pretty much at the same rate, if not higher, than we're bringing women into the organization. And so I think it's so important that you look at both of those. So you've got this hard data, right? You see the numbers. Now to go and have conversations with women, look at your exit data, do some things proactively and have those conversations to be able to, again, kind of look at it holistically. So it's like ask, whether that's through surveys, through that one-on-one, through focus groups, then take that information, analyze it, look at it. What are you seeing? And then the most important thing is to act on it. Sometimes we get the information, it's like, what do we do next? It's like, take it, act on it, do something, move it forward. So I think those are all really important things to think about in terms of measuring and looking.
That's great. Kevin, yeah, I'll open the floor to you as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important too who you survey. When we hire folks, we have actively engaged people. I had an old client that said, I want you to want to work here. So when I hire somebody, they should be excited. When I give them the offer, they should be excited. So I think it's very important, after a few months, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, you're surveying those new hires, because as we've talked about before, they come from the outside, coming in with a different perspective. They basically didn't know anything about your organization. So getting their viewpoint, I think, is so important. Because you have people who have been in an organization for 8, 10, 15, 20 years. They have unconscious bias. They may have those blinders on. I think you're going to get a very honest response. Those people are brand new to the organization. I think it's also very important in terms of demographics of who you're surveying, not just new employees, but survey your younger employees or millennials, Gen Z. Really want to take a look at what their thoughts are. And in connection with that, so important to hire entry-level younger individuals. You're going to create a larger funnel of a diverse candidate pipeline if you're looking at younger, more entry-level individuals, as opposed to, say, Kevin, hire a mainframe developer with 8+ years and they have to be in Salt Lake City. My pool is tiny. So talk to your managers about hiring more entry-level if you can.
Yeah. Can I just toss something in? Because you said younger, because I'm like, they can be entry level and maybe they're older as well too.
That's why I said younger and then I said entry level, because they
Yeah.
can be, we work with a Newmont, I think it's called Newmont College here out of Salt Lake City, and
Yeah.
phenomenal organization, diverse candidates out of this university or this college. And I think the cool thing about them is they have people switching mid career, which are just great candidates. I mean, you have somebody that worked in the restaurant industry, or worked as a construction foreman or something like that. And they come with this different perspective, and now they're a web developer. So I think it's so phenomenal to have individuals like that, and they're not younger. They're just they're entry level. They may be my age. So.
Or my age.
That's a great call out, Nancy. Thank you. So we are getting close to the end here, and maybe we have just a couple minutes for some questions. We did have one that I wanted to cover that's come in from someone who, when they were registering, they asked this question. And then Kevin, we have a really good question for you that's come in during the webinar that I'll pose to you. So Nancy, I'll go to you first. So the first question here is from Melissa. Melissa says that, and I kind of referenced this earlier about the roadmap, getting kind of just this overarching, this command to do something, but not really having a goal behind it. And you spoke about understanding what you mean by hiring and recruiting diverse candidates. So Melissa says, the business is not setting diversity hiring goals. However, they want recruiting to go ahead and recruit diverse talent. Is anyone else experiencing this, and does this even work? So again, it kind of sounds like there's this big difficulty in following something that higher ups are saying is really important, but there's no goal behind it. There's no roadmap. Do you have any advice for Melissa in terms of how does she get people to kind of to answer these questions that you've talked about, and to get a goal to where there's a more directive approach, and it's not just kind of hire more diverse talent?
Yeah, well, one thing is to start with, and we talked about this earlier, start with some of the data. So maybe you're working with a hiring manager, you see their team, let's say they've got a team of 20 people. Do some of the analytics and data and say, oh my goodness, one of the things I noticed on the team is that it's, 90% male, right? So when we're talking about diversity, it looks like we might be underrepresented in terms of women within this team. So just starting there, starting with some data, having some information to be able to bring to the hiring manager, because again, when you say diverse talent, what does that mean, right? And so really, language is so important. So diverse is anything different, right? So everybody here in this webinar with 100 something plus people, we're all diverse in some way. What I really think some of the hiring managers and organizations are saying is like, we're looking for talent that's underrepresented. So if you can start to just lead that conversation, bring them the data, show them where they may be underrepresented, that will at least help move that conversation along and get a little bit more clarity in terms of just this vague, we want to hire more diversity.
Thanks so much for answering the question. I feel like that can be really difficult, and I assume, Melissa, that many people are dealing with this same issue within their organizations. Kevin, earlier you talked about making sure that your interview panel is diverse and asking the same questions to candidates. So we have a question here from the audience that says, to Kevin's point about asking the same questions and rating responses on the same scale, how would you account for different communication styles and neurotypes?
Yeah, I mean, you still have to make the interview human. I talked to our managers about letting candidates know, hey, we're going to run a structured interview process. We'll ask you 5 to 10 questions, and then we'll open it up. So I do think you want to run through those questions. You do need to get the appropriate answers, right or wrong or in the middle, and sometimes there's no right or wrong, and you do need to score those, but you do need to open it up to a Q&A at the end to get a feel for their interest in the role. Like I said, we want somebody to want to work here. I think that's so important to show that they're engaged in the interview and they're asking questions. So I think it's key to still make that very human when you're doing the interview panel. And I will say this, you can't always have a diverse interview panel, but keep in mind who your interviewers are. I used to have an old colleague who said, we don't want to hire any brilliant jerks. And I think we don't want any interviewers that are brilliant jerks. And I'm not saying you have interviewers that are jerks, but you do have people that are interviewers that can be, let's say, harsh, which is not inviting for a candidate. So make sure you truly understand who your interviewers are and you put the right people on that panel. It's not just having random diverse individuals on the panel. It's also diverse individuals or individuals on that panel that can give you the appropriate feedback that is hopefully unbiased.
Can I just add one thing that I've seen some organizations doing lately, particularly for interviews that are virtual, is that they've been asking candidates, do they have any, or do they require any accommodation? So
Hmm.
maybe if they're doing something via Zoom, maybe they need to have it transcribed, but just to simply ask that question up front. And that can also play into and help support if somebody is neurodiverse as well too. So I've been seeing more and more organizations do that.
To tack on to that, Nancy, don't have too many interviewers. Sometimes I'll see managers say, all right, set up this interview, and there's 8 interviewers, and it turns into the Brady Bunch scenario on Zoom or MS Teams. So make sure you have a decent amount of interviewers. I like to keep it at 3, so you have a diverse panel, but the candidate knows who the heck the question's coming from.
Those are such great points, and I think ties back really to this intentionality that we talked about at the very top of the webinar. For me, at least, that's been a common theme from all of your answers, is to be intentional about your approach to all of this. It's not simple, and you want to get input constantly that can inform where you move next. And it's a journey, like you've said, Nancy. It's not somewhere we're going to end up and that's the destination and we're done. It is a journey that you constantly want that feedback and you want to make intentional decisions throughout the process. So I want to respect both of your times. We're a few minutes over here, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. The insight that you shared has been fantastic. And I really hope that everyone who is on the webinar today, or if you're watching on demand, that the information you learned today can help you make a difference in your organizations and ultimately for the tech profession. As always, reach out to us if you have questions. We didn't get to every question that did come in, but hopefully we can follow up on some of those for you. We did reference the DICE Equality in Tech reports today, and like I mentioned, if you haven't checked it out, there's a lot of data there. So please do check it out if you have the time to dig into that. We'll include a link here in the chat, I think, before we close the webinar, but also in the follow-up email that you'll receive in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And then also we have that short survey that will also be in the follow-up email. Please take just 2 minutes to let us know, did we answer your questions? Are there questions you still have? Would it be helpful to have another webinar about a specific topic within the DE&I space? And it's also an opportunity to let us know if you want to talk to someone on the DICE team about learning more about how we can help you recruit and hire technologists specifically. So please do take just 2 minutes to fill that out for us. As I said, it should appear in your inbox in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And then that second follow-up email will have the recording. That'll show up in the next 24 hours. And you're welcome to share that with your colleagues, anyone you feel could use this information, which I feel like is a lot of people. So please forward that email as you see fit. And you can also check out the recording, like I said, on DICE's YouTube channel later this week. But that is all we have for you today. Nancy, Kevin, thank you so much for being panelists today. We really appreciate all the insight that you shared.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. We hope everybody has a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.